Biographies are in your booklet if you want to learn a little bit more about the background of our speakers. And to my left is Gabriel Scheinmann. He's the executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society, and I already told him every time I say that or read it, I have the Hamilton soundtrack in my mind, which is...
If only we got the royalties, but that's not the case.
It's a great association. So we invited you to speak with us today because we're interested in learning about how the different communities in the United States approach the election and the foreign policy issues that affected them or that affected their vote. So let's start out broadly to begin. How did foreign policy play into voting decisions in your opinions? On a related note, how are Americans affected by foreign policy in their daily lives, and to connect it to what Liz was just saying, how do we make Americans more engaged in the discussions that we have around foreign policy? So why don't we start with you, Andrew? We start them young at Foreign Policy for America, I can tell.
Do I have this on? No. Is this on now? Yeah. Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I have to start by just saying that it's a pleasure to be on stage with three people I really admire quite a bit. Liz Schreier has been such a leader and a pillar in our community in galvanizing support for the international affairs budget for years, and I think we all try to learn and look up to her leadership. Dina, being one of the country's leading pollsters and analysts looking at American public opinion on foreign policy, so I'm a little bit daunted being on a panel where you're asking me questions about this. And Gabe leads a really important and critical institution engaging our students. All, and let's be clear, with a similar focus, recognizing the tremendous value that Americans have always gained from an internationalist foreign policy, from principled U.S. leadership in the world, from openness, support for international cooperation, multilateral institutions, support for democracy and human rights and values that are bigger than just narrowly defined security, working through our alliances rather than going alone. My organization, Foreign Policy for America, we founded in 2017 in a moment quite a bit like this one, where I think a lot of us looked around and thought, first, our tradition of internationalism is being challenged in a way that it really hasn't been in the last 7 decades. And second, what can I do about it? What can I as an individual on my own do about it? And you know, I had those same thoughts, and I'm looking at the headlines and frustrated and concerned. And I know that I as one individual can't do it alone. And so we started Foreign Policy for America as a membership-based organization with members across the country, not really a grassroots organization, a grass tops organization, an organization of leaders around the country who want to take action and want to support principled U.S. leadership in the world and recognize that we've got to do it as part of one big community together. So I'll shout out one other set of leaders that I really admire is all of you. The World Affairs Council plays a critical role in grounding foreign policy, thought leadership, ideas outside of Washington with stakeholders in your communities, in your cities that understand, most importantly, the local outcomes, the impacts of our foreign policy decisions. And nothing is more important than that at this moment. So I'm sorry for this long preamble, Dina. I know you wanted to ask us about what just happened in the election, but I had to start there. I will say, and maybe I'll ask you, Gabe, if you disagree, but I think we got to be cautious not to overinterpret the election results and think that there's more going on here than was. I think in many ways this is the easiest election to interpret in a while. It's a change election. 75% of voters who wanted change said Donald Trump was going to bring about was the candidate likely to bring about change, not Kamala Harris. And quite a few voters thought that change was the most important thing that they wanted in a candidate and in this outcome for the election. And so I think it's pretty simply the same thing that we've seen in every advanced economy since COVID, was it's really hard for the incumbents. There's a lot of pain felt by a lot of people. It was really dispersed. And there's an impulse. The impulse in the United States was similar to what we saw in the UK and France and Germany and Japan and South Korea and India and Botswana. In this case, exit polls show Kamala Harris was viewed as less extreme than Donald Trump. Her approval ratings were higher than Donald Trump. They believed more that she would do the things that she said she was planning to do than Donald Trump. But they wanted change so badly they voted for him anyways. So anyways, I don't want to overinterpret or throw some foreign policy aspects in there and make them more important than they were in the outcome of the election. Although I agree with everything that Liz was saying, especially about the ad spending. But I think that's what explains the election outcome. But Gabe, I don't know if you disagree with that.
Well, so first, I'm just going to say ditto to Andrew's preamble. It's all the thank yous and stuff, just because in the interest of time, I feel like repeating the same compliments is probably not the best use of your time in that way, but ditto on all these things. And if you're interested in our work as an organization, you can go to alexanderhamiltonsociety.org. We're on 80 college campuses across the country, sending out speakers that believe in sort of our worldview about America as an exceptional nation, America has an exceptional role to play in the world, to actually debate faculty on these college campuses on any matter of foreign policy, national security issues, and have a huge alumni base here in Washington as well, and do a lot of programming here and in New York. I agree with Andrew's point that I don't think foreign policy issues were determinative as to the election result. I think it is pretty straightforward of, you look at the polls, it's something like 75% of the country thought it was going in the wrong direction. Joe Biden's approval rating was below what Donald Trump's was when he was in office at the time, and Harris didn't seem to try, but couldn't in any meaningful way distinguish herself or separate herself from President Biden and the Biden's record, and I think that more or less is the whole story. But I do think that foreign policy shows up in a lot of issues that did matter to people in the election. Border security is a prime example of this. I do think that a lot of people look at the immigration question and the migration question through a border security lens, and that is a national security issue. The fentanyl crisis that we've been dealing with for almost a decade now. 70 or 80% of the chemical precursors that go into that are made in China and imported in Mexico and cross over the border. I mean, this is a national security issue, a personal national security issue and a lot of issue. Trade, right? I mean, the president-elect is talking about significant tariffs across the board, but the current president, President Biden, isn't exactly governed as a free trader either, right? And so these are also issues that play in that role. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? Also, I think played a role in cutting in different ways depending on the candidates. Hamas's barbaric attack on Israel and the wars that it has unleashed since played a huge issue. A lot of what I deal with in terms of what I see on college campuses in the last year, a huge issue, I think, in a lot of people's minds over what is going on in the country and what is causing some of these things. And so I think, and again, Dita will have the numbers. I don't think, if you ask people, why did you vote in this election? What mattered in this election? They're selecting something that looks like explicitly some sort of foreign policy box. But when you look at economic issues, when you look at immigration issues, when you look at some of the cultural issues, you look underneath each of those things, and there's a number of things that are foreign policy related.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you both said. Just adding in that even in focus groups that we've conducted, people say, even if we wanted to extricate ourselves from what's going on in the world, it would be impossible because we're so linked economically and in global institutions that there's no way we could, even if we wanted to. So very few Americans really fit that extreme isolationist box. There are a lot of Americans who don't want military action to be the only answer or the primary answer to foreign policy issues. But diplomacy is their preferred approach. So now we have so much to cover and so little time. So I think we're going to hit some specific issues. And Gabe, I'd like you to talk a little bit about American views, or at least the communities that you speak with on a daily basis, how we should be approaching the issue of China in terms of trade, in terms of global competition.
All in like 40 seconds is what you're saying?
No, I think since we started a little bit late, we could maybe have a couple more minutes.
Sure. So, look, I do think that when you talk, and I deal in particular with a lot of young Americans, and so it's a certain slice. But I do think there is a consensus here from a lot of Americans that the Chinese Communist Party is an adversary, if not an enemy, of the United States. Point blank. There isn't necessarily a lot of consensus over what one ought to do, right? What the policy ought to be, although even there's some. But I think that is felt through a lot of people and through the elections. And so again, the tariff issue, you know, President-elect Trump has talked about 10% tariffs across the board, but he talks about 60% on China, right? And he talks about mostly in terms of jobs and trade deficit. But again, I think a lot of Americans see that as like, you know, China's eating our lunch, stolen a lot of our stuff, and now harassing us in a whole bunch of different ways. Oh, this is a measure to try and combat that, right? Border security is the same thing. You know, I think it's the Chinese citizens illegally crossing the border is the fastest growing national community crossing the border. And you're sort of like, it's not from the Triangle, it's not from South America. How are they getting here? Again, it's not that is what's causing the crisis. It's not there. But Americans see that and say, look, this is a tool that we should be doing to combat China. Same thing on military stuff. President Trump talks about building a bigger military, building a big missile defense, being stronger and all these things, you know, allies we can get to in a second. Again, Americans, I think, see that as a way to be tougher, that we need a tougher position. When candidate Trump rails against the United Nations, the WHO, a lot of that is because he sees that, and I think the American people see that, as those institutions have been, you know, co-opted, taken over, to some degree corrupted by adversaries of the United States for ill, right, against our own interests. And so, again, I think on each of, you can examine each slice of a policy that, let's say, he's put forward. Energy is another example, a policy that he's put forward, and there is a being tougher on China element in each of those things. That doesn't necessarily mean that is exactly the playbook that one should run one in office, but I do think that resonates with the American people and resonated in the election.
Andrew, how about Ukraine?
Well, I can try there, but could I respond real quick on this?
Of course.
So, two things that you said I just wanted to, comment on or foot stomp. Oh, thank you. Keep the feedback coming. On China, this is actually one of the areas where in foreign policy for America, we've invested some in focus groups and polling. I think you're right, Gabe. It is a preeminent challenge that Americans recognize because it's real, and they see it in so many different aspects of their lives. I think one of the biggest things that I saw, my takeaways in looking at these focus groups and polling that we conducted was, if you had to rank top goals for Americans, number one, stay out of a war. Yeah. And that is really important to recognize, especially in DC, which, as President Obama said, DC kind of inclines towards war. And we have kind of a knee-jerk hawkishness that is easy to come by for elected officials, for political leaders, and doesn't always resonate with voters. But there's always a risk, candidates, members of Congress are afraid of not looking tough enough. And so there's sort of a slippery slope towards a consensus around an overly hawkish approach that doesn't naturally resonate, I think, with where voters are at. What I think voters want to see with China relationship is to manage it effectively, which means you got to talk to them. Talking to Chinese, talking to our adversaries is not an unpopular view. It's what we think adults do when we got to negotiate and manage tough challenges. Number two is China's taking unfair economic actions, if they're engaged in industrial espionage, if they're trying to cause other problems for our families, you got to protect us from that. So definitely take protective actions. And then number three, like I said, stay out of war. I think those are important touchstones for us to remember for what broadly resonates. And I thought it was really interesting to see when we look at that ad spend by the Trump camp, Trump and Trump-aligned PACs, there was a focus on avoiding World War III, right? Which is broadly resonant, and sometimes we forget that here. You guys all know this because you're not in DC, but we forget it here. Second thing I just wanted to say, Gabe, absolutely right. I do think foreign policy matters quite a bit and mattered for the low approval ratings that President Biden dealt with. If you look through the polling in the months where we withdrew from Afghanistan, President Biden's approval rating dropped 10 points and never came back. And he dealt with two other crises, 1.5, I would say. The Israel-Gaza crisis. I don't think he agrees with everything I'm saying. And Ukraine. And that, it turns out, is really important to voters, is how is the leader going to respond to a crisis? If you look at exit polling in this presidential race, if you said that Trump, people have diverse, heterodox, complicated views, but if you say, I trust this person more in a crisis, pretty much 100% of those folks voted for, if you trusted Harris more in a crisis, 100% of those voters, basically 95, 99% voted for her. If you trust Trump more in a crisis, again, you're probably about 95% chance you're going to vote for Trump. So the voters' views on, do I trust this person to lead us through a crisis, aligns very closely with their actual voting behavior. And a lot of that, I think, is shaped in international crisis moments. And I do think that was a really important piece of the story in 2024. I didn't answer Ukraine at all. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. There's just not a...
I can jump in on Ukraine real quick if you want, and then you can, because I think it's the second biggest issue. So one result that probably might surprise people here, despite the debate, let's call it, inside the Republican Party on support for Ukraine, is not a single Republican lawmaker who voted to support aid to Ukraine lost re-election. Didn't lose in the primary, in the Republican primary, or in the general. Not a single one. And so while we don't know exactly what's going to happen, right, and the president-elect has been sort of like, I'm going to end this on day one, but it's sort of not clear how, in terms of how the voters see it, I don't think you had a lot of voters who were, kind of Republican internationalists said, I don't know where the party's going in Ukraine, I'm going to go for Kamala Harris or in that way. So I think it actually played less of an issue in the vote than one might have expected, despite certainly in certain states, Ukrainian American communities, you had President Zelensky's visit to Pennsylvania and then Utah earlier in the year, right? In these ways, I think it was less important than the Iran issue, than the no more wars issues, than the China issue.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up now. I would love to speak for hours with you two. Can you please give a round of applause to our speakers?